One of the hardest things that we did this year when it came to place value was rounding our numbers. So we're going to work through a couple of them together right now so we can practice that rounding skill. So if you had a number, let's say it was 8.456 or 8 and 456 thousandths, and you were asked to round it, there's a couple options that you have. Depending on how they asked you to round it would affect really where you start. Because looking at this number, I can either round it to the nearest hundredths, I could round it to the nearest tenths, I could also round it to the nearest one, or sometimes we refer to it as a whole. So you have to be prepared to hear it as a one or a whole. I could also technically round this to the nearest tens place. So let's work through this a little bit. So remember when we round, we use our vertical number lines. So you always start by just drawing your number line. And then let's start with hundredths. So if I'm rounding this to the nearest hundredths place, first I'm going to find the number here that's in my hundredths place. Well, looking at this, I've got the 8 and the 1s, the 4 and the tenths, the 5 is in the hundredths place. So I'm going to just write 8.45 as my bottom number. That means that I could round it down to 8.45 as my hundredths if I'm rounding to the nearest hundredths. All I did was I looked at what number is in my hundredths place. That became my bottom number, 8.45. Now to figure out my top number is I have to add 1 unit. Now, because I'm talking about hundredths, I'm only going to add 1 hundredth. So my 8.45 is going to become 8.46. 5 plus 1 is going to give me a 6. So all I did was I added 1 hundredth. Basically, I'm deciding if 8.456 will fall either to an 8.45 or an 8.46. I looked at what's in the hundredths place and I went from there. Now, to figure out which direction it's going to go is I need to identify the midpoint. And midpoint is what is halfway between these two numbers. And we learned that for the most part, we can always follow the general pattern that halfway between something is going to be 5. Like halfway between 0 and 10 is 5. Halfway between 10 and 15 is 15. Or 10 and 20 is 15. So halfway between 8.45 and 8.46 is 8.455. So we took that bottom number and just added our 5 to it. Now we can look at it and see, where does this number fall? 8.456. Is 8.456 lower than 8.455 or higher? Well, you can basically just look at that and consider that 456. To me, 456 is bigger than 455. So I would put my number right here. Because I put my number above the midpoint, if anything is above the midpoint, we always round up, right? Anything above the midpoint, we round up. Anything below the midpoint, we round down. So when we rounded this number to the nearest hundredths place, it would be 8.46. Let's try it again to the tenths place. Same number. So 8.456. Remember our steps. Step 1 is to fill out my bottom and top numbers here. The bottom number, because this is tenths, again, I'm going to look here and find the number in the tenths, 8.4. That 4 is in the tenths, so it's just going to become an 8.4. Now to find my top number, I'm going to add 1 tenth, because I'm dealing with tenths, to 8.4. 1 tenth bigger than 8.4 is 8.5. Midpoint between 8.4 and 8.5 is going to be 8.45. Right, I just added a 5 to my bottom number. Now I need to figure out where this goes. 8.456. 8.456, that's not going to be bigger than 8.450. This one we use our comparing number skills, and yes, it will be. Because of having a 6 thousandths is bigger than having a 0 thousandths. So again, we're going to round up. It's going to be 8.5. Let's try it with 1 and whole. Okay, same number. I'm going to pick my bottom and my top numbers. Because I'm talking about 1, I'm going to go to the number in the ones place. That's just an 8. So my bottom number is going to be 8. My top number will be 9 because all I'm doing is I'm adding 1 to my bottom number. Halfway between 8 and 9 is going to be 8.5. So now I'm plugging this in, 8.456. Is that going to be less than 8.5 or greater than 8.5? Well, comparing numbers, they both have an 8 in the ones place, but when I go to the tenths, I have a 5 versus a 4. A 4 is smaller, so 8.456 is going to be less than 8.5, which means I round down to 8. So if I'm rounding to the nearest one or whole, I can say it is worth 8. The last one, which might be considered almost a trick question, is if you're asked to round it to the nearest tens place. So we're going to treat it the exact same way. I'm going to look at my digit in the tens place. Well, what is my digit in the tens place? In the tens place, there is not one, which means it's going to be 0. If I'm adding 1 10 to 0, I get 10. What's halfway between 0 and 10? 5. 8.456 is above 5. So I'm going to round up to 10. Rounding to the nearest tens would give us 10. So that's a little tricky because you have a 0 here, because on the bottom, because I don't actually have a number here in my tens place. Remember to find your bottom number, you look at the place of your actual number, what digit is there, and because there's nothing there, that's why it became 0. The only time that rounding can get a little tricky is if we get into like the 0.9s. So if I had the number that was 13.99 and I wanted to round it to the nearest tenths place, we should be able to set it up. I draw your number line. We know we need to label the top and bottom number. Tenths place is 1 or tens, ones, tenths right there. It's a 9. So it's 13.9. Your top number is just adding one of your value. Because I'm dealing with tenths, I'm going to add a tenth. Well, 13.9 plus 1/10 is going to be 13 and 10 tenths, which actually is 14. This is the only time where it gets a little tricky. Think of it as 139 if it helps you. 139 plus 1 is going to be 140. So when you have a 9, it bumps over because we know we can't have two digits in the same place value. I can't actually have it be 10, or it would no longer be 13.10. It would be 13.1. Halfway between 13.9 and 14 is 13.95, and then I can plug that in, round up to be 14. So rounding to the nearest tenths gives me 14.0 or 14 because I had to add a tenth, and so it changed it into a 14 there. So that's the only kind of time it might get tricky for rounding. Basically, if you remember to set up your number line correctly and go through all those steps, you're going to be able to solve it. It's just sometimes we get a little held up in our number line creation. So just remember your steps is to draw your number line, identify what your bottom number will be, and you know your bottom number based off of what place you're rounding to. So if I'm rounding to the tenths place, let's pretend I find the number in the tenths place, and so it is 8.4, so my bottom number is 8.4. My top number is always just one more than my bottom number. Because it's tenths, I have to add 1/10, so it becomes 8.5. Next thing you have to figure out is your midpoint. 8.45. Again, the more you practice this, the more patterning it will get for you and the easier it comes. And then you plug your number in. Where does it actually fall? 8.456, it's above 8.45, so I'm going to round up. Okay, rounding can be a little tricky. Just practice your number lines and identifying your starting off points, so your bottom, top, and midpoint, and then it's just plugging in and figuring out where does that last number go.